Carter Hale hit the dust outside Mabel's diner, expelled like poison from a town that wrote his past across his skin in permanent ink. Drywood, Kansas didn't forgive. It only watched, waited, whispered. Sheriff Boyd's hand still burned with righteous force. The heat pressed down like judgment itself, thick and unforgiving. Then Lily Marston's small feet kicked up gravel, her voice splitting the assembled silence. "My hero?" Two words that made the sheriff's badge feel suddenly terrifyingly heavy. Subscribe now to witness how the smallest voice can shatter the hardest certainty. The dust of Drywood, Kansas had a way of settling into every crease of a man's skin, working its way past collar and cuff until it became indistinguishable from the flesh itself. A second epidermis of drought and disappointment that marked everyone who stayed long enough to be claimed by the prairie's relentless thirst. Carter Hale had that dust ground so deep into the lines around his eyes that even the rare Kansas rain couldn't wash it clean, 34 years of it accumulating in the creases that mapped every mistake, every locked door. Every morning he'd woken to the knowledge that Drywood remembered what he'd rather forget. The sun hung white and merciless at 10 in the morning, already baking Main Street into something wavering and uncertain. Heat rising in visible columns that made the storefronts shimmer like they weren't quite real, weren't quite fixed in the world of solid things. He walked with his head slightly bowed, not from shame exactly, but from the long habit of making himself smaller, taking up less space, existing in the margins where men like him were permitted to move through towns that had already decided what he was worth. The hardware store, the post office, the feed supply with its faded sign advertising prices from 2 seasons past. Each building stood as a silent witness to his passage, windows reflecting nothing back to him but the ghost of motion, the suggestion of a man who'd learned to move through the world without leaving much of an impression. His boots, worn through at the heel and stitched back together with fishing line and determination, kicked up small clouds with each step, adding to the general haze that made breathing in Drywood feel like inhaling the memory of better times, back before the drought came and stayed, and turned optimism into something people spoke of in past tense. The town had a population that hovered somewhere around 430 souls, though that number fluctuated with the seasons and the failures of wheat crops and the quiet departures of young people who understood that dreams required more water than Drywood could offer. Every face that turned toward him as he passed carried its own particular shade of recognition, not the warm kind that welcomed, but the cold assessment of people who'd already filed him into a category marked dangerous, unreliable, not one of us, despite his years among us. Mrs. Henderson tightened her grip on her grandson's hand when Carter moved past the pharmacy, pulling the boy closer as if proximity to the ex-convict might somehow contaminate, might transfer through the superheated air some essence of criminality that could infect innocence. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but Carter registered it the way a man with frostbitten fingers registers the slightest change in temperature, with the heightened sensitivity of someone who'd learned to read rejection in its thousand subtle forms. He didn't blame her. Not really. Because blame required the kind of energy he'd stopped wasting years ago, somewhere between his sentencing and his release, between the man he'd been and the careful construction of silence he'd become. The morning stretched ahead of him with the weight of routine. Walk to the diner for coffee he couldn't quite afford, sit in the corner booth if it was available, nurse the single cup for as long as Mabel's patience allowed, then disappear back to the boarding house room where he'd been living since his parole officer had arranged the placement with the particular tone of voice that made it clear this was charity, not welcome. Mabel's diner occupied the corner of Main and Oak, a squat building whose red paint had long since faded to a rust that seemed appropriate for a town slowly oxidizing under the relentless sun. The neon sign in the window, open, flickered with the neurotic rhythm of failing wiring, buzzing loud enough to be heard from the sidewalk. A sound Carter had come to associate with the possibility of bitter coffee and the temporary respite of air conditioning that wheezed but still functioned. He could see through the plate glass that the usual morning crowd had gathered, farmers in overalls still carrying the smell of diesel and fertilizer, their faces weathered into permanent squints from decades of scanning horizons for rain that rarely came. The bell above the door would announce his entry with its bright jangle, a sound incongruously cheerful for what always followed. The brief pause in conversation, the sidelong glances, the subtle shift of bodies away from wherever he chose to sit. He'd developed strategies over the months since his return, small tactical decisions about timing and positioning, arrive early before the crowd built, or arrive late after people had settled into their conversations and were less likely to notice. Sit with his back to the room to avoid meeting eyes, or sit facing forward to demonstrate he had nothing to hide. Both options equally exhausting in their own particular ways. Today, he'd chosen mid-morning, the time when the breakfast rush had thinned, but before the lunch preparations began, a narrow window when Mabel sometimes had a moment to exchange actual words, rather than just the transaction of currency for caffeine. The heat pressed against the glass door as he reached for the handle, warmth radiating through the metal in a way that made him pause, that split second of contact burning his palm enough to make him jerk back before trying again with the edge of his worn shirt wrapped around his fingers for protection. Inside, the air conditioning hit his face like a blessing, cool and artificial and carrying the mingled scents of bacon grease and industrial coffee, the particular perfume of American diners from coast to coast, reassuringly familiar even in its cheapness. The bell jangled, and the conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, modulated, became performances of themselves, with new awareness of an audience they didn't want. Mabel stood behind the counter, her grey hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn for the 20 years Carter had known her, first as a kid, coming in for milkshakes with money earned from lawn mowing, then as a teenager, courting the girl who eventually left for college and better prospects. Finally, as the man who returned from prison with nothing but the clothes the state had provided, and the understanding that home was a place that might tolerate your presence but would never again celebrate it. She looked up from wiping down the formica, and her expression did something complicated, softness and wariness fighting for dominance. The memory of the boy he'd been wrestling with the knowledge of what he'd done, what he'd become, in the eyes of Drywood's collective judgment. He moved toward his usual spot in the back, the booth with the cracked vinyl that had been repaired with duct tape the color of primer gray, the table that wobbled unless you folded a matchbook under the short leg. His route took him past 3 occupied tables and 1 empty foretop, where someone had left a newspaper spread open to the classifieds, help-wanted ads circled in blue ink by someone searching for a future that might include employment and dignity. The farmers at table 2 fell into the particular silence of men who'd already said what they thought about Carter Hale, and saw no reason to repeat it directly to his face, though their opinion hung in the air as surely as the cigarette smoke that curled from the ashtray, despite the no smoking sign Mabel had posted 2 years back, with about as much enforcement as a scarecrow exercises over crows. He was almost to his booth, almost to the temporary sanctuary of coffee and the view out the back window, where the prairie stretched away toward nothing in particular, when the door opened again and the bell's jangle changed in character, became somehow more official, more weighted with authority that required acknowledgement. Sheriff Leonard Boyd stepped into Mabel's diner with the particular bearing of a man who understood his presence altered rooms, who'd spent 23 years in law enforcement and developed the swagger that came from wearing a badge in a small town where few challenged the holder. Boyd's eyes found Carter immediately, locked onto him with the focus of a man who'd been thinking about this moment, perhaps planning it, certainly anticipating it, with something that looked uncomfortably like pleasure. The sheriff's hand rested on his belt near his service weapon, not touching it, but positioned close enough to remind everyone present who held the monopoly on sanctioned force in Drywood, who could turn disagreement into lawful restraint with the simple action of reaching 6 inches to the right. Carter felt his stomach drop with the particular sensation of inevitability, the recognition that whatever came next had already been decided, had been building with the same slow certainty that storm clouds gathered on a prairie horizon, dark and undeniable, and headed straight for where you stood with nowhere to hide. The temperature in the diner seemed to shift despite the laboring air conditioner, became charged with anticipation, with the crowd's eagerness for drama that didn't directly threaten them, that would provide conversation fodder for days while costing them nothing but the price of watching. Carter remained standing beside his booth, caught between forward motion and retreat, his body understanding before his mind fully processed that this morning would not include coffee, would not include the small mercy of being ignored, would instead deliver the confrontation that had been circling since his return, drawing closer with each encounter until finally it landed here, in Mabel's diner, with the whole town represented by proxy through the farmers and the lingering breakfast stragglers who suddenly had no intention of leaving. Sheriff Boyd's boots made deliberate sounds on the checkerboard linoleum, each step a measured announcement of approach, the rhythm of authority that didn't need to hurry because it knew cooperation would be given or forced, either option equally acceptable to the man wearing the badge. His face carried the particular expression of righteousness that Carter had seen before in the courtroom, in the prison visiting room, when his mother had come that one terrible time before the shame became too much and the visit stopped, the look of people who decided they stood on the moral high ground and viewed the landscape from that elevation with satisfaction. Boyd's weathered skin bore the marks of a lifetime in Kansas sun, deep lines bracketing his mouth that could have been from squinting or from decades of frowning at the failures of others to meet his exacting standards, hard to say, which had carved those particular channels deeper. His uniform was crisp despite the heat, pressed and maintained, with the care of a man who understood that appearance was half of authority. That intimidation began with the visual statement of order and control. Behind him, the morning light streamed through the door he'd left open, a rectangle of white heat that made his silhouette dark and imposing, backlit like a figure in a Western showdown, except there would be no fair fight here, no equitable exchange of challenge and response. Carter could smell the sheriff's approach, aftershave and leather, and the metallic tang of the service weapon's gun oil, scents that triggered visceral memories of being arrested, of rough hands and the back of a cruiser, and the beginning of the end of whatever life he'd imagined for himself before the mistakes compounded beyond redemption. "Didn't expect to find you here, Hale," Boyd said, his voice carrying across the diner with the projection of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. The words themselves were neutral, but the tone underneath ran cold with implication, with the suggestion that Carter's presence anywhere in Drywood was unexpected and unwelcome, a continued affront to the sheriff's sense of how the world should organize itself. Carter felt the eyes of every patron shift to him, felt the weight of their collective attention like pressure against his skin, making breathing harder, making the air conditioning's cool suddenly insufficient against the heat rising in his face. He wanted to respond, wanted to say something that would de-escalate, that would allow this moment to pass without incident. But his voice had become stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat, trapped by the old familiar fear that speaking would only make things worse, would provide ammunition that silence couldn't. Mabel had stopped moving behind the counter, her hand frozen on the coffee pot she'd been about to refill, her face showing the conflict of a woman who'd known both men for decades and found herself suddenly forced to choose a side in a confrontation she'd probably been hoping to avoid. The farmers at table 2 had gone completely still, their breakfast abandoned, their attention riveted on the unfolding drama with the fascination people reserved for accidents and arguments and anything that broke the routine of drought and declining wheat prices. "You got business here?" Boyd pressed, taking another step closer, narrowing the distance until Carter could count the days since the sheriff had shaved, could see the tiny burst blood vessels in his nose that spoke of either rosacea or drinking, or the combination of stress and age that broke down barriers between capillary and surface. The question was rhetorical, designed not to elicit information but to establish dominance, to force Carter into the position of justifying his existence in a public space, of defending his right to occupy the same diner where he'd eaten countless meals across his lifetime. Carter's hands had curled into loose fists at his sides, not in preparation for violence, but in the involuntary response of a body remembering other confrontations, other times when authority had manifested in physical removal, in compliance achieved through force rather than consent. He made himself uncurl his fingers deliberately, made his hands relax and hang loose because he knew how this looked, knew that any gesture could be interpreted as aggression by a man looking for justification. "Just came for coffee, Sheriff," he managed, his voice emerging quieter than he'd intended, almost apologetic, and he hated the sound of it. Hated the way prison had trained him to make himself small and deferent before anyone with power over his circumstances. The admission felt like surrender, even though it was simple truth, felt like giving ground before the battle had even properly begun. Boyd's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry contempt the way water carries poison, subtle and lethal. "Coffee," he repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meaning, for evidence of some deeper transgression concealed in the simple desire for caffeine. "That what you call it when you come around here making decent people uncomfortable? When you sit in that booth and stare at families trying to have their breakfast in peace?" The accusations came wrapped in questions that weren't questions at all, but statements painted with the thin veneer of interrogation, each one landing like a physical blow despite the absence of actual contact. Carter could feel his face burning now, not with anger, but with the particular humiliation of being dressed down in public, of having his presence characterized as an imposition, a burden that Drywood bore with reluctant tolerance. He wanted to argue that he'd done nothing, that sitting quietly in a booth nursing coffee hardly constituted harassment, that his presence was as lawful as anyone else's in this public establishment. But the words wouldn't come, choked off by the knowledge that law and lawfulness meant different things depending on who you were, that his history had stripped him of the presumption of innocence that others enjoyed. Around them, the diner had gone absolutely silent, not even the sound of cutlery against plates breaking the tension. Everyone frozen in the tableau of confrontation, like extras in a film, waiting for the director to call action so they could resume their secondary movements. Mabel finally found her voice, thin and uncertain, calling from behind the counter, "Leonard, maybe we could—" But Boyd cut her off with a raised hand, not even looking at her, his attention fixed on Carter with the focus of a man who'd been waiting for this opportunity and wouldn't be diverted from it by appeals to decency or de-escalation. "This doesn't concern you, Mabel," he said, his tone suggesting that her decades of serving both men counted for nothing in this moment, that her establishment had become his stage and she merely a prop with no speaking role in the scene he was directing. Carter saw the hurt flicker across her face before she shuttered it, before she stepped back into the position of witness rather than participant. Her silence a kind of abandonment he registered with dull recognition. The sheriff's hand had moved closer to his belt, still not touching the weapon, but near enough that the threat was implicit, that everyone understood violence remained an option held in reserve, ready to deploy if Carter failed to comply with whatever came next. "I think it's time you left, Hale," Boyd said, volume rising enough that even the couple in the far booth by the window could hear every syllable, could understand this was for their benefit as much as Carter's, a public demonstration of authority maintaining order. "This establishment doesn't need your kind of trouble. These people don't need to be reminded of what you did every time they're trying to eat their eggs and toast. And the phrase, "you're kind," landed with particular weight, heavy with all the implications of categorization and othering, reducing Carter's humanity to the single fact of his conviction, erasing 34 years of existence into one permanent defining characteristic. He felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking exactly, but developing a fissure. The kind of damage that accumulates over time until one day you discover the whole structure has become unsound and collapse is inevitable. His legs had begun to move before his mind fully caught up, automatic compliance with authority, the learned behavior of someone who discovered that resistance only extended suffering, never prevented it. He was backing toward the door when Boyd's hand shot out and grabbed his arm just above the elbow, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, hard enough that Carter knew he'd find bruises there tomorrow in the shape of the sheriff's grip. "And Hale?" Boyd said, pulling him close enough that Carter could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the satisfaction in his eyes at having his authority acknowledged. "Don't come back. You want coffee? You brew it in whatever hole you're living in. Mabel's is for people who've earned the right to be part of this community." The words were delivered at conversational volume, but they might as well have been shouted, might as well have been printed in the Drywood Weekly Gazette for all the privacy they afforded, and Carter felt each syllable add weight to the permanent record of his shame. The door slammed behind Carter with enough force to rattle the glass, the sound sharp and final, like the closing of possibilities, like the sealing of a tomb around the parts of him that had still hoped for redemption, or at least for being left alone to exist quietly in the margins. The heat hit him immediately after the artificial cool of the diner's interior, a wall of temperature that made his eyes water and his lungs constrict. The sudden shift from one extreme to another, disorienting his body's attempts to regulate itself. He stumbled on the step down from threshold to sidewalk, caught himself on the post that supported the awning, splinters digging into his palm from wood, dried and cracked by seasons of Kansas sun. Behind him, through the glass, he could see the diner's patrons already returning to their breakfasts. The moment of drama concluded satisfactorily, order restored, the unwelcome element expelled so that digestion could resume untroubled by the presence of criminality. Mabel stood motionless behind the counter, her face turned toward the window, her expression something he couldn't quite read at this distance, regret maybe, or resignation, or simply the blank acceptance of someone who'd watched this scene play out before in different variations, different actors occupying the same archetypal roles. Carter straightened slowly, forcing his breathing to steady, despite the twin pressures of heat and humiliation making his chest tight, making each inhalation feel inadequate to the task of sustaining life. Main Street stretched away in both directions, empty at this mid-morning hour when those who had work were already at it, and those who didn't were inside avoiding the worst of the sun's assault. The dust he'd kicked up walking here had settled back into place as if he'd never disturbed it, as if his passage left no more impression on Drywood than breath leaves on mirror, visible for an instant, then gone, the surface returning to its prior state of blankness. He could feel sweat breaking out across his back, soaking into the cotton shirt already damp from the walkover, adding to the general sensation of his body betraying him, leaking and failing, and insufficient to the demands being placed on it. His legs felt unsteady, not from the physical act of being ejected, but from the psychological impact of public rejection, from having his unworthiness declared before witnesses who'd carry the story outward until everyone in Drywood knew, until the episode became legend, became the confirmed proof they'd been waiting for, that men like him couldn't be rehabilitated, couldn't be allowed back into society without disrupting its peace. The boarding house where he rented his narrow room sat 3 blocks south, a walk that suddenly felt insurmountable, a distance measured not in yards, but in the accumulating weight of shame that made each step require conscious decision rather than automatic motion. He'd made it perhaps 50 feet when he heard the screen door of the White House across from the diner slam open with its particular rusty shriek, heard the rapid patter of small feet on wooden porch steps, heard a child's voice calling out, high and clear, cutting through the morning air with the piercing quality that only young vocal cords could produce. Carter didn't turn immediately, assuming the call was for someone else, some parent or sibling, unrelated to his solitary trudge toward isolation. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, running now with the heedless speed of childhood when urgency matters more than dignity or careful placement of feet. "Wait!" the voice called again, identifiable now as female, young, somewhere in that range between learning to read and losing baby teeth, the age when the world still seemed changeable through belief and action. He stopped, despite his instinct to keep moving, stopped because his mother had raised him to respond when children called, had instilled in him some core of courtesy that even prison hadn't fully eroded. Turning, he found himself looking down at a girl in a yellow sundress printed with sunflowers, her dark hair escaping from two braids, her knees scabbed from some recent encounter with concrete or gravel, her face flushed from exertion and streaked with what might have been yesterday's dirt imperfectly washed. She skidded to a stop 3 feet from him, close enough that he could see her chest heaving with the effort of her sprint, could count the freckles scattered across her nose like seeds broadcast at random, could register the fierce determination in her brown eyes that suggested she'd made some decision and intended to see it through regardless of obstacles or consequences. He recognized her vaguely, had seen her around town in the peripheral way one notices children who aren't one's own, playing on the elementary school swings when he walked past, sitting on this same porch occasionally when he passed, always observed from distance, always part of the background of Drywood's ongoing life rather than its foreground. Her name surfaced from memory without his consciously searching for it. Lily Marston, daughter of the hardware store owner, and his wife, who'd grown up here and stayed here and raised their family in the same house where they'd been raised, the kind of generational rootedness that Carter's own family had once enjoyed before everything went wrong. The girl stared at him with unsettling directness, none of the wariness adults showed, none of the careful assessment of threat and propriety that made most interactions with Drywood's residents feel like negotiations with hostile territory. She simply looked at him as if he were a person rather than a category, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened, as if Boyd's public ejection had no bearing on what she'd decided to do. "I saw what the sheriff did," she said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of children who haven't yet learned that observations can be uncomfortable to voice, that some truths are meant to be kept silent for the sake of social cohesion. Carter glanced back toward the diner involuntarily, checking whether anyone inside was witnessing this exchange, whether some adult would emerge to claim the child and shepherd her away from the dangerous ex-convict with his corrupting influence. But the glass showed only the continuation of breakfast, Mabel now refilling cups with the pot she'd been holding frozen, the farmers bent again over their plates, Boyd's back as he occupied a stool at the counter, his posture radiating satisfaction. "You should probably get back to your house, Lily," Carter said, using her name without thinking, then worrying that knowledge of her name might seem threatening somehow, might be interpreted as inappropriate familiarity with a child. The girl shook her head with the emphatic conviction of someone who knew their own mind and saw no reason to doubt it. "I saw what he did, and it was wrong," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, projecting across the empty street with enough volume that Carter winced, certain this would draw attention, would result in some parent racing out to rescue their daughter from his vicinity. "Sometimes adults have reasons," he began, trying to craft an explanation that would satisfy her sense of justice while moving her away from him. away from association with someone who could only damage her standing in the community by proximity. But Lily cut him off, stepping closer. Close enough now that he could smell the sweet, sharp scent of the juice box she must have been drinking. See the small scar on her chin from some childhood accident. Register the fierce protectiveness in her young face. "You're my hero," she said. And the words made no sense, landed in his comprehension like a foreign language he'd never studied, like a message decoded wrong, every syllable refusing to form coherent meaning. He stared at her, mouth open, trying to formulate a response, trying to understand what she meant or why she would say such a thing to him, to Carter Hale, to the man the whole town knew had done time for assault, had returned broken and quiet and deserving of nothing but suspicion and exclusion. The girl's eyes had begun to shine with tears, not sad exactly, but fierce, emotional in the way children could be when they felt something deeply and had no adult-learned restraint about expressing it. "You don't understand," Carter started, his voice emerging rougher than intended, scraped raw by confusion and the dangerous pressure building behind his own eyes. The threat of his own tears that he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years because crying was weakness, and weakness in prison meant prey. But Lily was already moving, already throwing her small arms around his waist, pressing her face against his stomach, holding on with the strength of someone who decided this was her position and wouldn't be dislodged. "My hero," she repeated, muffled against his shirt, and then louder, pulling back slightly to look up at his face. "My hero." The second time she said it with enough volume that the word carried, that it reached the diner's window, that it penetrated the glass and the noise of resumed conversation and landed in Sheriff Boyd's awareness like a grenade lobbed into the comfortable fiction he'd just finished constructing. Carter saw through the window as Boyd's head snapped around, as the sheriff's face registered first confusion, then something darker, as his hand moved toward his service weapon with the automatic reflex of a man whose authority had just been challenged in the most unexpected way possible, by a 9-year-old girl calling the man he'd just expelled a hero, calling into question the entire moral framework Boyd had used to justify his actions, making the sheriff's righteousness suddenly uncertain, suddenly open to interpretation, suddenly negotiable where moments before it had been absolute. Time performed one of its strange compressions, the kind that happens in moments of crisis when seconds expand into vast territories that contain multitudes of thought and sensation, while simultaneously passing too quickly to react, the present becoming both eternal and insufficient all at once. Carter felt Lily's arms still locked around his waist, felt the heat of her small body through his shirt, felt the wet spot where her tears had soaked the fabric, all physical sensations registering with heightened clarity while his mind struggled to process the implications of what was unfolding. Through the diner window, he watched Sheriff Boyd rise from his stool with the jerky motion of someone whose nervous system had gone into emergency mode, watched the calculations happening behind the sheriff's eyes as training and procedure collided with the optics of a child embracing the man he'd just publicly humiliated. The other patrons had noticed now, faces turning toward the window, hands stopping mid-gesture to point, mouths forming words Carter couldn't hear but could imagine, speculation and surprise, and the rapid recalibration that communities undergo when new information forces revision of accepted narratives. Mabel stood frozen again, her face pressed close to the glass now, her expression complex with emotions Carter couldn't separate into discrete categories, could only read as the general disturbance of someone watching something unexpected with unclear consequences. Lily pulled back from the embrace, but kept one hand fisted in his shirt, maintaining physical connection as if breaking contact might break her courage, might allow adults to reassert their version of reality and invalidate what she knew to be true. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her jaw was set with determination, with the particular stubbornness of children who'd decided they were right and would die on this hill if necessary. "Tell them!" she demanded, looking up at Carter with eyes that expected honesty, that hadn't yet learned how adults specialized in strategic omission and careful shadings of truth. "Tell them what you did. Tell them why you're my hero." Her voice carried across the street, loud enough that it would be audible inside the diner if anyone cracked a window, loud enough that Mrs. Henderson emerged from the pharmacy 3 doors down to investigate the commotion, her grandson still in tow, both of them stopping to stare at the scene with undisguised curiosity. Carter felt his throat close around nothing, felt words pile up behind his teeth, each one too heavy to speak, too complicated to explain in this public space, with an audience gathering and a child's expectation that truth was simple, was speakable, was something adults engaged in rather than avoided. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what she was talking about, didn't understand what heroism she'd imagined or projected onto him in her child's mind that made no sense when applied to the reality of who he was and what he'd done. The diner door opened, and Boyd stepped out, his hand no longer near his weapon, but his entire body language screaming aggression barely contained, coiled tension that might spring at any moment into action that couldn't be recalled once released. He moved down the steps with exaggerated slowness, each bootfall deliberate, as if giving Carter time to think better of whatever was happening. Time to extract himself from the child and remove his contaminating presence before things escalated beyond words into the territory where the sheriff's authority could manifest more directly. "Lily, step away from Mr. Hale," Boyd commanded, his voice adopting the particular tone adults used with children when they expected immediate obedience, when disobedience would have consequences. But the girl only tightened her grip on Carter's shirt, only pressed herself closer to his side, her free hand now grabbing his wrist, holding on with both hands as if he were a life raft, and she was drowning, as if proximity to him was the only thing keeping her afloat in waters that threatened to pull her under. "No," she said, simple and absolute, the single syllable hanging in the superheated air with surprising weight for something so small. Boyd's face darkened, color rising from his collar, spreading across his weathered cheeks in blotches that spoke of blood pressure and anger, and the particular fury of authority questioned by those who had no right to question. "Lily Marston, you get away from that man right now," Boyd tried again, adding her full name as if formal address would increase compliance, would remind her of social hierarchy and the requirement that children defer to adults in uniform. Around them, more people had emerged from buildings, drawn by the raised voices and the sense that something significant was occurring, something worth witnessing and later discussing. Mr. Peterson from the bank stood in his doorway, arms crossed, face showing disapproval, though whether directed at Carter or at the girl or at the situation itself remained unclear. 2 teenage boys on bicycles had stopped in the street, straddling their bikes, watching with the particular intensity of adolescents who understood instinctively that power dynamics were being negotiated and the outcome might affect their own future interactions with authority. Carter wanted to release himself from Lily's grip, wanted to step back and diffuse the situation, wanted to do what the sheriff commanded because compliance was survival, and he'd learned that lesson thoroughly. But the girl's hands held him with surprising strength, and beneath that physical grip, he felt the weight of her belief in him, felt the terrible responsibility of being named hero by someone who didn't understand he was nobody's hero, had never been anyone's salvation, had in fact been the cause of suffering rather than its relief. "He saved me," Lily shouted suddenly, her voice cracking with emotion, with the desperation of someone whose truth wasn't being heard, whose reality was being denied by adults who thought they knew better. He pulled me out of the creek when I fell through the ice last winter. He saved me, and he didn't tell anyone, and he made me promise not to tell because he said people wouldn't understand." The words tumbled out in a rush, flooding the space between them and the gathered crowd. Information cascading faster than anyone could process, than anyone could verify or dispute. Carter felt his entire body go rigid with shock, felt memory resurface with crystalline clarity. February, the creek behind the elementary school, where it widened into something almost worthy of being called a pond. The ice that had looked solid but was rotten underneath. The crack that had sounded like thunder. The splash he'd heard from where he'd been walking the perimeter of town, trying to burn off the restlessness that made his boarding house room feel like a cell. The girl flailing in water so cold it paralyzed. The thick ice chunks that made swimming impossible. The desperate reach of his arm, the terrible weight of her waterlogged clothing, the frantic scramble to pull her out, to get her breathing, to warm her with his jacket while she coughed up creek water and shivered violently enough to make speech impossible. He'd walked her home in silence, had watched from across the street to make sure she made it inside, had seen her mother open the door and pull her into warmth and safety, and then he'd left, had returned to his room, had stripped off his own wet clothes and tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing by not announcing it, by not turning a rescue into an opportunity for attention or redemption-seeking. He'd told her not to mention him because he knew how it would be interpreted. The ex-convict lurking near the elementary school, putting his hands on someone's child, inserting himself into a narrative where he didn't belong and would only corrupt what should have been a simple story of accident and rescue. The lie of omission had felt like protection for both of them. Protection for her from association with him, protection for him from the inevitable suspicion and ugly speculation. But Lily apparently had different ideas about protection, about silence, about the debts children felt when someone saved their lives. Boyd had gone absolutely still, his face no longer red but pale, the color draining as he processed what the girl had said, as the implications rearranged themselves in his understanding, as the man he'd just humiliated and expelled became suddenly complex, became possessed of a history that Boyd hadn't known, hadn't investigated, hadn't considered relevant to his simple equation of criminality equals unworthiness. The silence stretched long enough that Carter could hear the wind moving through the wheat fields at the town's edge, could hear the electrical hum of the power lines, could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears, like drums, signaling something approaching, something inevitable, something that would change everything even though he couldn't yet see what form that change would take. Lily's mother had appeared now on the porch of the White House, her hand raised to shade her eyes, her body language showing confusion and concern as she tried to understand why her daughter was in the street, why Sheriff Boyd stood frozen, why the man from the boarding house had his child's tear-stained face pressed against his side. "Lily!" Mrs. Marston called, her voice thin with the beginning of fear, with maternal instinct detecting threat, even if she couldn't identify its source. But Lily didn't release Carter, didn't move toward her mother, didn't do any of the things a child was supposed to do when called by the voice that had soothed every nightmare, had bound every wound, had provided every comfort since birth. Instead, she looked up at Carter with eyes that demanded he confirm her story, that begged him to speak the truth she'd protected for months, that pleaded for him to be brave enough to own the heroism she was claiming on his behalf, even though he'd never wanted it claimed, had never sought recognition, had only done what any decent person would do when a child was drowning. Sheriff Leonard Boyd's hand rose slowly to his chest, fingers touching the badge pinned above his heart with the reverent gesture of someone seeking reassurance from a holy relic, seeking confirmation that the symbol still meant what it had meant 5 minutes ago, before a child's voice had introduced uncertainty into the moral mathematics he'd been calculating with such confidence. The metal was warm from his body heat, solid and real against his fingertips. But somehow the weight of it had changed, had become heavier or perhaps lighter. He couldn't tell which, couldn't sort out whether the badge now pressed down with accusation or floated with insufficient gravity to keep his authority anchored to his chest. Around him, the gathered crowd had begun to murmur, voices low but building. The particular sound of a community processing new information, weighing it against established narratives, deciding collectively what this meant for the social order they'd constructed and maintained through careful attention to who belonged and who didn't. Boyd could feel their attention shifting, who could sense the way their focus had moved from simple acceptance of his judgment to something more complicated, more questioning, could feel his power over their perception beginning to slip like sand through fingers that gripped too hard and only accelerated the loss. Mrs. Marston had descended from her porch and was crossing the street now, her cotton dress fluttering in the hot breeze, her face showing the transition from confusion to understanding, to something that might have been horror or gratitude or the complicated mixture of both that parents experience when they learn their child's life was saved by someone they'd been taught to fear. Her hands were already reaching for Lily, even at 15 feet of distance. Maternal instinct making her fingers curl around air where soon her daughter would be, pulling the girl back into the safe circle of family, away from whatever dangerous proximity this moment represented. But her eyes kept darting to Carter, kept returning to his face, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the man whose name had been synonymous with warning since his return, as if the features needed rearranging to accommodate the new information, needed to be rebuilt from scratch, using different assumptions. Boyd watched this recognition happen, watched it spread across her face like sunrise, illuminating features one by one until her entire expression had transformed from wariness to something uncomfortably close to gratitude. And he felt his stomach twist with the realization that he'd miscalculated, had performed his authority for an audience that was now questioning whether his performance had been just. "Is it true, Lily?" Mrs. Marston asked, dropping to her knees in the dust, careless of the pale cotton now staining with Kansas dirt, her hands finally reaching her daughter, pulling the girl close, checking her with the automatic thoroughness of mothers who needed physical confirmation of wholeness, needed to touch and verify that harm had not come while they were looking away. Lily nodded against her mother's shoulder, her fierce determination finally breaking into full tears. The courage that had sustained her through confrontation with the sheriff now dissolving into the safety of maternal embrace. "He pulled me out," she sobbed, words muffled but still audible to the crowd that had grown to perhaps 20 people, all straining to hear, all invested now in understanding the complete story. "The ice broke, and I went under, and I couldn't breathe, and Mr. Carter pulled me out, and he gave me his jacket, and he walked me home, but he said not to tell, because people wouldn't understand." The last words came out bitter, accusatory, as if the child understood now the injustice of silence imposed, understood that Carter's protection of her had been also a protection of himself from exactly this kind of scrutiny, exactly this kind of public reckoning. Boyd felt his jaw clench, felt his teeth grind together with enough force that pain radiated up into his temples, felt his carefully constructed righteousness beginning to crack like the ice Lily described, fissures spreading from a point of impact, threatening to plunge him into cold water where breathing became impossible. He'd known about the ice incident, everyone had heard Mrs. Marston's panicked call when Lily came home soaked and hypothermic, had gone to the creek himself to investigate, had found the broken section of ice and the disturbed snow on the bank, but no witnesses, no explanation for how the child had gotten herself out. The working assumption had been that she'd managed it alone, that she'd been lucky, that the angels people claimed watched over children and fools had been particularly attentive that day. No one had considered that someone might have helped and chosen silence, might have performed rescue without seeking credit, might have had reasons for anonymity that were protective rather than sinister. The possibility had never entered Boyd's investigation because it contradicted the narrative he'd constructed about Carter Hale, that the man was fundamentally selfish, fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally incapable of the kind of selfless action that rescue required. Mabel had emerged from the diner now, followed by 3 of the farmers, all of them standing on the sidewalk with expressions of discomfort, with the particular unease of people realizing they'd participated in injustice, had been complicit in public humiliation of someone who deserved better. Mabel's hand was pressed to her mouth, as if holding back words or holding in emotion, her eyes shining with tears that matched the tracks already visible on Lily's cheeks. Boyd could feel the weight of her disappointment, even without looking directly at her, could sense the way the town's maternal figure was judging him and finding his actions wanting, finding his rush to judgment premature and cruel. Mr. Peterson had moved closer too, his banker's face showing the careful recalculation of someone who dealt in risk assessment and had just discovered that his metrics were flawed, that the man he'd written off as bad investment might actually represent value he'd failed to evaluate properly. The teenage boys on their bicycles had gone still, no longer fidgeting, their adolescent faces showing something like awe or respect as they looked at Carter, as they recategorized him from cautionary tale to something more complicated, something that didn't fit the simple binaries of good and bad they'd been taught. Carter himself had remained completely motionless through all of this, his face showing nothing, giving away no emotion that Boyd could read and use, revealing no vulnerability that might be exploited or softness that might be pressured. His silence was different from the terrified compliance he'd shown in the diner, was no longer the silence of someone broken, but the quiet of someone who'd made peace with being misunderstood, who'd chosen discretion over vindication because vindication required belief he'd stopped expecting from Drywood or anywhere else. Boyd found this silence more disturbing than anger would have been, more unsettling than defensive justification, because it suggested a moral certainty that existed independent of what others thought, existed beyond the reach of Boyd's authority to validate or condemn. The sheriff's hand dropped from his badge and hung at his side, suddenly purposeless, suddenly uncertain where to position itself when not reinforcing power or preparing for conflict. His throat felt tight, constricted by something that might have been anger, or might have been shame, or might have been the recognition that he'd become the villain in a story where he'd cast himself as hero, that his badge didn't automatically confer righteousness, that authority without wisdom was just sanctioned bullying. Mrs. Marston had straightened now, still holding Lily's hand but standing to face Boyd directly, her posture no longer deferential, no longer showing the automatic respect that citizens generally offered to law enforcement in small Kansas towns where social hierarchy was clear and rarely questioned. "Sheriff Boyd," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her face, "I think you owe Mr. Hale an apology." The words landed in the superheated air like stones in still water, sending ripples outward through the crowd, through Boyd's chest, through the entire morning that had started with such certainty and had deteriorated into this, being instructed by a citizen about his obligations, being corrected by a woman whose judgment of him was visible in her disappointed expression, being called to account by the very people whose approval he needed to maintain the authority he wielded. Boyd opened his mouth, but no words emerged, his throat producing only a dry click as he tried to form syllables that wouldn't come, tried to craft an apology his pride insisted wasn't necessary, while his conscience whispered might be insufficient even if offered. His mind raced through options, doubling down on his original position, finding some technical justification for his actions, reframing the situation so that he remained right, even as circumstances suggested otherwise. But each option rang hollow, even in his own thoughts, each potential response feeling like the desperate maneuvering of someone losing an argument they'd already lost. Carter felt the moment extending beyond comfortable duration, felt the expectation building in the silence like pressure before a storm, felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes waiting for something. His response, his acceptance of the apology that Boyd still hadn't managed to produce, his own accounting of what had happened last February and why he'd chosen secrecy over recognition. His throat was dry, made drier by the heat and the adrenaline still coursing through his system from the confrontation, making his tongue feel thick and clumsy when he finally forced it to form words. "No apology needed, Sheriff," he said, and watched Boyd's face show relief so transparent it was almost painful to witness. Watched the tension in the man's shoulders ease fractionally, as if the burden of contrition had been lifted before he'd fully shouldered it. But Carter wasn't finished, wasn't offering complete absolution, wasn't quite ready to let the moment resolve into comfortable forgiveness that would allow everyone to return to their prior positions without adjustment or growth. "You did what you thought was right based on what you knew. Can't blame a man for that." The words came out flat, carefully neutral, stripped of the bitterness he felt, but wouldn't voice because bitterness required energy he'd stopped wasting on reactions to how Drywood treated him. Mrs. Marston's expression showed she heard what Carter hadn't said, registered the subtext of pain underneath the carefully diplomatic phrasing, understood that grace offered didn't mean wounds healed or trust restored. She squeezed Lily's hand and looked at Carter with eyes that carried their own complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt, of relief that her daughter was alive and remorse that the man who'd ensured that survival had been treated so badly for so long. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the attentive silence. "Why didn't you let us thank you? Why let people think—" She broke off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence, to articulate what people thought about the quiet ex-convict who kept to himself and asked for nothing from the community that had once known him as a boy with potential and now knew him only as a cautionary tale. Carter shifted his weight, feeling the ache in his leg where an old prison injury flared up whenever he stood too long. Feeling the accumulated fatigue of carrying tension in every muscle, feeling older than 34, feeling like someone who'd lived multiple lifetimes in the span of years that should have contained only one. "Figured it was better that way," he said finally, his voice rough as creek gravel, worn down by years of not using it much, of choosing silence over the complications that came with speech. "People see a man like me near kids. They think things I'd rather they didn't think. Lily was safe and warm and home. That's what mattered. Didn't need credit for doing what anyone would have done." The explanation fell short of complete truth, didn't capture the full complexity of his reasoning or the self-protective instinct that had guided his choice, didn't acknowledge how tired he was of being looked at like a threat, like a mistake, like someone whose very presence required defensive measures and heightened vigilance. Around him, he could feel the crowd processing this, could sense the shift in collective understanding as people re-evaluated not just the rescue, but the months of silence that had followed, the decision to prioritize a child's reputation over his own rehabilitation in the community's eyes. Mabel was openly crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face, her hand still pressed to her mouth as if holding back sounds that might emerge as sobs if she lowered her guard. One of the farmers from the diner, Jenkins, Carter thought his name was, though he'd never spoken directly to the man, cleared his throat with a wet, rough sound that drew attention. "I seen you walk the creek perimeter every few days," Jenkins said. his voice carrying the particular discomfort of someone admitting they'd been watching. They'd been noticing patterns. They'd been drawing conclusions from incomplete data. Thought maybe you were, I don't know, scoping things out or something. Guess you were just checking the ice stayed safe. The admission hung there, naked and uncomfortable. An acknowledgement that surveillance and suspicion had been the community's default response to Carter's presence, that innocent actions had been interpreted through the lens of prejudgment until they appeared sinister. Carter didn't respond, didn't know how to respond to this revelation that he'd been watched and misinterpreted, that his careful monitoring of the place where a child had nearly died had been read as threat rather than protection. The irony was too bitter to laugh at, too painful to anger about, so he simply let it sit between them like something broken that couldn't be repaired, but had to be acknowledged. Boyd had found his voice again, though it emerged quieter than before, stripped of the commanding projection that usually characterized his speech. "Why didn't you report the rescue, Hale? Official channels exist for a reason. There should have been documentation, investigation, proper recognition." The words sounded formulaic, even as Boyd spoke them, sounded like someone reaching for procedure to avoid discussing substance, reaching for the familiar structures of law enforcement protocol to avoid the more difficult terrain of moral complexity. Carter felt something twist in his chest. Something that might have been amusement if it weren't edged with too much pain to qualify as humor. "You want the truth, Sheriff?" he asked, and didn't wait for confirmation before continuing. "I didn't report it because I knew exactly what would happen. You'd have asked questions about why I was there, what I was doing, whether I'd been following the girl. You'd have turned a rescue into an interrogation, made me prove I wasn't the threat you've decided I am. And Lily would have had to answer questions, would have been examined and poked and made to relive nearly drowning, all so you could document something that was already done, already handled, already over." The analysis was delivered without heat but with absolute certainty, with the particular knowledge of someone who'd learned to predict how systems would respond to him, who'd developed the survival skill of anticipating how his actions would be reframed through suspicion until innocence became impossible to demonstrate. Boyd's face flushed again, but this time with something different than anger, something that looked uncomfortably like recognition, like the unwilling acknowledgement that Carter was right, that the procedures Boyd clung to as neutral and just were actually mechanisms that could be weaponized against those already marked as questionable. The sheriff's silence became its own kind of admission, became the space where denial should have been, but wasn't, became evidence that even he couldn't fully reject the truth of what Carter had said. "Mrs." Marston's grip on Lily's hand had tightened until her knuckles showed white, until the girl made a small sound of discomfort and pulled back slightly, reclaiming circulation. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Marston said, and the words weren't directed only at Carter, but seemed to encompass the entire gathered crowd, seemed to be an apology offered on behalf of Drywood itself for the collective failure to see him clearly, to give him the benefit of doubt that others received automatically, to recognize that criminal history didn't erase capacity for goodness. Lily had pulled free of her mother's grasp completely now and moved back to Carter's side, her small hand finding his larger one, her fingers threading through his with the unself-conscious ease of children who hadn't yet learned that touch could be complicated, could carry implications, could be misread as inappropriate rather than offered as simple connection. Carter froze at the contact, every muscle locking down, hyper-aware of how this would look, how someone might interpret a grown man holding a child's hand in the middle of Main Street with an audience of witnesses. But Lily held on with determination that matched her earlier fierceness, held on like she was making a statement, like she was claiming him publicly as someone worthy of touch, worthy of affection. worthy of the basic human contact that Drywood had systematically denied him since his return. "You're still my hero," she said, looking up at him with eyes that held no doubt, that contained none of the skepticism and judgment that adult eyes carried, that saw him simply as the person who'd saved her life and therefore deserved her loyalty regardless of what others thought or said or decided was appropriate. Carter felt his vision blur, felt moisture gathering that he blinked back furiously, felt his throat close around emotions he'd kept locked down for so long that their emergence felt dangerous, felt like losing control in a situation where control was the only thing protecting him from complete unraveling. The sun had climbed higher during the confrontation, had reached that angle where shadows disappeared and everything became exposed to light that revealed rather than concealed, that made visible the dust on clothing and the sweat on faces and the complex emotions that people preferred to keep hidden beneath the performance of certainty. Carter stood at the epicenter of Drywood's attention, with Lily's hand still clasped in his, stood under the merciless white heat that pressed down like judgment itself, like the very sky was weighing him and finding him wanting, despite the child's fierce advocacy. He could feel his shirt clinging to his back, could taste salt when he licked his dry lips, could sense the passage of time in the ache developing in his feet from standing so long in boots never designed for prolonged immobility. Around him, the crowd had grown restless, shifting from foot to foot, exchanging glances that communicated without words, engaging in the silent negotiation that groups perform when deciding collectively how to respond to situations that defy their usual frameworks of understanding. Some faces showed softening, showed the beginning of reconsideration, showed the cracks appearing in the armor of prejudgment they'd worn so comfortably until today. Others remained hard, unconvinced, clinging to the original narrative because changing it would require admitting they'd been wrong, would require apologizing for months of coldness and exclusion, would require effort they weren't prepared to expend. Sheriff Boyd had removed his hat at some point, was turning it slowly in his hands, examining the brim with intense focus, as if the answers to his moral dilemma might be found in the wear patterns of felt worked smooth by years of handling. His hair was plastered to his skull with sweat, showing the shape of his head, making him look vulnerable in a way the hat usually prevented, revealing the human underneath the uniform in a manner that was distinctly uncomfortable for everyone present who preferred their authority figures to remain icons rather than people. "I need to think," Boyd said finally, the words emerging slowly, as if each one required individual consideration before being released into public space. "Need to review what happened today, what was said, what it means for." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to specify what needed review, what consequences this revelation would have for his actions, for his standing, for the entire social structure of Drywood that depended on clear demarcations between respectable and disreputable, between safe and dangerous, between those who belonged and those who were merely tolerated. Carter noted that Boyd didn't apologize, didn't retract his earlier actions, didn't offer anything resembling acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, only that he needed time, needed distance, needed the space to reconstruct his understanding without the pressure of an audience witnessing his moral confusion. Mrs. Marston nodded slowly, accepting this non-apology as perhaps the best that could be expected in the moment, recognizing that pride sometimes needed time to bend before it could break enough to allow contrition through. "Come on, Lily," she said gently, extending her hand toward her daughter, inviting rather than commanding, requesting rather than demanding the girl's return to the safety of family and home, and the structures that existed to protect children from exposure to adult complications. But Lily shook her head, her grip on Carter's hand tightening. her small face set with the particular stubbornness that parents learn to recognize as the precursor to battles they couldn't win without collateral damage that exceeded any victory's value. "I want to walk with Mr. Carter," she announced, her voice clear and unwavering, containing no awareness of how scandalous this request was, how inappropriate it would be deemed for her to be seen walking through town with the ex-convict, how her parents standing in the community might be affected by visible association between their daughter and the man everyone had agreed to keep at arm's length. Mrs. Marston's face showed conflict, showed the competing impulses of gratitude and social caution, showed the mother's desire to honor her daughter's wishes, warring with the citizens' awareness of how Drywood judged and talked and remembered. "Lily, honey, I don't think—" she began, but Carter cut her off gently, his voice soft but firm, making the decision before the moment could become more difficult for everyone involved. "Your mama's right to be cautious, Lily. I appreciate what you said. Appreciate what you did today, but you should go home now. You've been brave enough for one day." He squeezed her hand once, a brief pressure of connection, then carefully extracted his fingers from hers, despite the resistance she offered. Despite the way her small hand tried to maintain its grip, Lily's face crumpled, tears threatening again, her body language showing betrayal, as if he'd proven himself unworthy of her defense by declining the gift of her continued companionship. "But you're my hero," she protested, voice breaking on the last word, making it a question rather than a statement, making it sound like his refusal was somehow a rejection of the identity she'd bestowed, the salvation she'd offered by naming him valuable in a town that insisted he wasn't. Carter felt the protest land in his chest like a physical blow, felt his resolution waver under the weight of her disappointment, felt tempted to accept her offer, to walk with her through Drywood and dare the town to say something, to challenge their judgment with the evidence of a child's uncomplicated love. But he knew that path led nowhere good, knew that Lily's parents would suffer for her choices, knew that children's advocacy didn't change adult prejudices, but only complicated them, created resentments that would express themselves later in subtler ways. "Heroes do what's right, even when it's hard, Lily," he said, kneeling down so his face was level with hers, so she could see the sincerity in his eyes, so she would understand this wasn't rejection, but protection. "Right now, what's right is you going home with your mama and me continuing on my way. You saved me today just as much as I saved you last winter. You spoke up when no one else would. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I'll remember it every single day." The words cost him, came from a place he usually kept locked down, came from the parts of himself that still believed in meaning and connection, despite years of evidence suggesting such beliefs were naive. Lily's tears spilled over, but she nodded, accepting his explanation even as she rejected the outcome, leaning forward to hug him one more time, her small arms wrapping around his neck, her wet face pressed against his cheek, leaving behind the salt trace of her crying when she finally pulled back. Mrs. Marston stepped forward then, her hand gentle on her daughter's shoulder, guiding Lily away from Carter with the care of someone handling something precious and breakable. Her eyes meeting Carter's over the child's head with an expression that communicated volumes without words, gratitude and apology and promise, all compressed into a single look that lasted only seconds, but felt weighted with significance that would continue long after this moment passed. The crowd had begun to disperse during this exchange, people drifting back toward their businesses and errands. The drama concluded, or at least suspended, the revelation absorbed, and now requiring time to be processed individually before the community could decide collectively what it meant and how to respond. Boyd had retreated to his cruiser parked outside the diner, had climbed inside and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. his face visible through the windshield, showing a man wrestling with thoughts that offered no easy resolution. Mabel had returned to the diner but stood visible through the window, her hand raised in a small wave when Carter's eyes found her. A gesture of solidarity or acknowledgement, or perhaps just recognition that he existed, that he mattered, that what had happened today changed something, even if neither of them could articulate exactly what that change entailed. Carter watched Lily and her mother cross back to the White House, watched the screen door close behind them, watched the normal rhythms of residential life resume as if the morning's confrontation existed in some separate reality that didn't intersect with the ordinary business of living. He stood alone again in the center of Main Street, dust settling around his boots, heat pressing down on his head, the boarding house waiting 3 blocks south like it always had, patient and indifferent and offering nothing but shelter that cost most of what he made, doing odd jobs for the few people willing to hire him. The street was quieter now, returned to its usual mid-morning emptiness. The brief population drawn by drama now dissipated back into the buildings that contained their actual lives. Carter began walking, his feet moving automatically toward the familiar route, toward the narrow room with its single window and its mattress that sagged in the middle, and its hot plate that sometimes worked and sometimes required creative electrical arrangements to function. But something had shifted, something subtle enough that he couldn't name it precisely, but present enough that he felt it with every step, the weight on his shoulders slightly lighter, the air marginally easier to breathe, the possibility of tomorrow containing something other than repetition of yesterday hanging like the faintest promise just beyond his ability to grasp. Behind him he heard the diner door open, heard Mabel call his name, heard her footsteps hurrying to catch him before he moved out of range. He stopped and turned, squinting against the sun that haloed her grey hair, making her face difficult to read until she drew close enough that details resolved through the glare. "Coffee's still hot," she said simply, the offer extended without elaboration, without acknowledging the past hour's events, without referencing the fact that Sheriff Boyd had expelled him from this very establishment less than an hour ago. Carter looked at her, at the weathered kindness in her face, at the stubborn loyalty that had survived even when wisdom suggested loyalty was misplaced, at the woman who'd known him since boyhood and apparently hadn't completely forgotten the boy beneath the convict's scarred exterior. "I don't want to cause trouble for you, Mabel," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control, couldn't quite force back down into the locked compartments where he usually stored such dangerous feelings. She waved off his concern with a gesture that suggested his worry was ridiculous, was insulting even, was so far from relevant that it didn't merit serious consideration. "Let me worry about trouble," she said firmly. "You just worry about whether you want sugar with that coffee." And she turned, expecting him to follow, expecting him to accept the gift she was offering, not just caffeine but belonging, not just a seat but a place, not just tolerance but the beginning of something that might, with time and continued courage from small voices and old women, eventually grow into welcome. Carter stood for a long moment, feeling the sun burn into his shoulders, feeling the weight of decision, feeling the temptation to accept, and the fear that acceptance would lead to more pain when it was inevitably withdrawn. But Lily's words echoed in his memory. "My hero." And he thought maybe heroes were just people who kept showing up despite the costs, who kept trying despite the failures, who kept breathing despite the weight pressing down on their chests, making each breath an act of defiance against all the forces suggesting they should just stop, should just give up, should just accept that some mistakes couldn't be survived or redeemed. He took a step toward the diner, then another, each motion feeling monumental, feeling like crossing distances measured not in feet, but in years of isolation, in months of rejection, in the infinite space between being tolerated and being wanted. Mabel held the door open, the blessed cool of air conditioning spilling out into the Kansas heat, the smell of coffee reaching him like a promise that maybe, just maybe, in this small, sunburned town where judgment fell hard as hailstones, there was still room for grace to bloom from unexpected voices, for truth to reshape what seemed permanent, for one man's quiet sacrifice to finally, mercifully, be seen.